Okay, let's pray. Jesus, thank you for this time. Thank you for the opportunity to come together to learn more about you and to be in community, to offer to each other and listen. I pray that you would give us hearts that would hear what you would have us to hear, and that you would give us compassionate and grace-filled hearts for each other as we listen to each other speak and share, and bless this time. In your name I pray. Amen. All right. We today are finishing up our series on the books of the Bible. And it says down there, it says Job over there. That has turned into a preview for next summer because we messed up the schedule. So basically, what we do every year around October, November is we get everybody together, the elders and leaders, and we talk about, like, what does our community need? What do we need to talk about this year? And so we make a list for the whole year. And sometimes that gets messed up. Like last year, we ended up changing up basically the whole second half of the year, and we took out an entire series that we moved to January. So everything was kind of messed up this year, but it's worked out, I think, really well. And let me tell you why. So the first 3 months of the year, we went through the book of Daniel. And Daniel takes place during exile, which is the Israelite people were conquered by Babylon, and they were sent off. They were scattered throughout the empire, and a bunch of them, including a bunch of the nobles, went to Babylon, and they were there made to... anyway, I don't have to tell you the whole story, but you should go back and listen to the series. It's a really good series. But we went through the whole book of Daniel and basically talked about what does it look like for us to live in exile. And then, after that, we went over a few really difficult topics like grief and sadness and pain in this world. And then we talked about Jesus and the offices of Jesus. So Jesus as prophet, priest, and king. And then we started this series. And what I really like about this is that we went through Genesis, and we learned about the covenant relationship that God made with Abraham in Genesis, and then the relationship that he made with his people in Exodus, and then their travels through the desert, and their conquering of the promised land, and then their establishment of their living there, and their kings. And now, starting last week, really, 2 weeks ago, we're back in exile. And so we started in exile, we talked about Jesus, and then we went back to the beginning and found out how they got to exile. And then next week, we're starting a series on Luke, which is all about Jesus. So I'm very excited. It's been very fun to see the way this has all worked out together. But let me talk a little bit about where we are now. We are in Esther. And Esther takes place about 30 years after Ezra and Nehemiah. It's the latest book. It's really good that we're ending with this because it's the latest book of history in the Old Testament. Everything else that happens in the Old Testament happens before Esther. So next year when we do the books of wisdom, like the poetry and all that, and then we get into prophets and stuff like that, that all happens before Esther. So I like that we're covering the entire history up until the end of the Old Testament. How many of you have seen the movie 300? It's a terrible movie. Don't watch it. No, it's got some great action sequences, which I really enjoyed when I watched it. But then I watched it a second time and really did not enjoy it. So don't go watch it. But this is what you need to know about 300, is that what happens in the movie is that there are 300 Greek guys, and they stand in this gap, and the entire Persian army comes after them, and they defend the gap and allow for the Greek resistance to come together. And so when they all end up dying at the end, sorry, spoiler alert, the Greek army is ready to fight against the Persian army. It's this glorious story that we know about mostly because the Greeks wrote down everything. It's not really how it happened. In reality, the Persian Empire was the greatest empire at the time. They conquered many, many peoples, and they got to Greece and decided that it wasn't worth it. They were defeated in a couple battles, but they decided it wasn't worth it. But the king in 300 is this guy named Xerxes. and he's really creepy in the movie. But he's the most powerful man at the time, and Xerxes is the king in the book of Esther. So that, to give you some context of where we are in history, that's where we are, is at that moment in history. Xerxes is the king, he's the most powerful man in the world, and he's conquering everybody except for those 300 guys. Well, he did conquer those 300 guys. Anyway, let's move on. Xerxes, just to give you some historical context. So that's where it's about 500 years before Jesus, and I'm going to stop there. I'm going to move on. Because, okay, man, hold on. I'm really excited. This is very fun. Okay. Xerxes. Xerxes is king during the book of Esther. The people of God have returned mostly. Last week we talked about Ezra and Nehemiah, and Kevin said that so the people of God they were eaten by the fish that was Babylon, and then Babylon was eaten by the fish that was Persia because there's always a bigger fish. Yeah, okay. So the Persians, they had a different policy. They didn't take people away from their homes. They just dominated them. And so they're willing to send these people back. So at this point, a lot of the Jews have returned to Jerusalem. They're rebuilding the temple and the walls, but there's still a lot of them left scattered around what was the Babylonian Empire. And in fact, there's still a remnant of Iranian Jews, a lot of whom have moved out recently and are in LA apparently, which I learned from my brother. So that's interesting. That were there, they were there because they were scattered. Anyway, that's where we are in history. And before we get into the story of Esther, I'm going to pause. And we're going to go back to 2 weeks ago. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about Chronicles. And in 2 Chronicles, chapter 15, there's this story that Eric went through about King Asa. And he said that, and in that passage it says that they experienced the turmoil, and in their distress, they turned to God. And what he said was, he had these 3 pictures on the screen, and it said that they bound themselves to God, and then they took a stance that rooted themselves in God so that they could not be pushed over. And I would have Rod come up and demonstrate his karate, or what karate, right? Wei-Chi-Ru. The stance that you took so that you could not be pushed over. And the idea is that you root yourself down into the ground, right? So that's the idea. Is you bind yourselves to God, you root yourself into the ground, into God, and then you're pointed in a direction of love. And he said in a direction. So he said that the word that's used to point is the rod that they used to read the Torah. So they would follow along the word instead of pointing their finger at it. They would use the word. So the idea is that you're pointed in a direction by God. And I want to build on that today. We read 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We read a portion of it. Who can give me the really famous part of 1 Corinthians 15 or 13? Anybody? 1 Corinthians 13? Yeah. Love is patient, love is kind. Yeah. If you've ever been to a wedding, you've probably heard it. It's a very popular verse to read at a wedding. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not proud. But the section that we read is a little later, and it talks about this idea of completeness, that completeness is coming. So we learned about exile, and we learned about the way that the people engaged with God in exile and what they were called to. And this idea of being bound to God and rooted in God and pointed in a direction is very appropriate in exile, because what we encounter is the chaos and the turmoil of this world. But we have Jesus. And so Jesus is love, and what we learn is that we are known and loved by God. And so at the end of this passage it says, and now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love. And what I'm going to propose to you is that when we encounter the turmoil and the chaos of this world, we are called to bind ourselves to faith, bind ourselves by faith to God, to root ourselves in hope, and to point ourselves in a direction of love. So that we bind ourselves to faith, we're rooted in hope, we tell the stories of hope, and then we are pointed in a direction by love. And that love is not, we'll get into this a little more, but that love is not the feeling and the emotion, but it's an action. It's something that we enter into and that we choose to engage with, to care for people around us. So that's where we are. We are called to be bound by faith, rooted in hope, and directed by love. So let's talk about Esther. I'm just going to tell the whole story. Because if we go into like Samuel and Kings and Chronicles and all of these stories, there's so much happening that we couldn't tell the whole story. There's not as much happening in this one. The other one where we really got to hear the whole story was Ruth. And I would suggest that you go back and listen to the sermon on Ruth, which Kathy gave, because it's really, really good. But I'm going to tell you the story of Esther. So, we start with Xerxes, who's the creepy guy from the movie 300, and the most powerful man in the world at this point. So Xerxes decides that he's going to throw a big party. He throws a big rager. He invites all his friends, and they all get really drunk. And they're all hanging out together for several days. And his Queen Vashti, decides that she's going to throw a party also. So at the same time, she's throwing a big party with all her friends, and they're all getting drunk, and the king's getting drunk. And then on the last day of the party, the king says, I want to see my wife. I want to see the queen, and I want to show her off to all my friends. Seems like a really healthy relationship. I want everybody to see how beautiful she is. And so he sends his eunuch off to bring Queen Vashti, and she says, no, I don't want to do that. And so Xerxes is enraged, and he calls his advisors to him. He says, what do I do? And his advisors say something that I find kind of funny and awful. But they say, well, you have to do something about this. You have to do something about this, because if you don't and you let this stand, all the women of the Persian Empire are going to rise up against their husbands. That's their advice. That's what they tell him, which is just ridiculous. Yeah, it's really weird. Anyway, yeah, none of them were married. Is that what you said? None of his advisors were married? I really think you just get a group of people together and they tell you what you want to hear, because he's the most powerful man in the world. They tell him what he wants to hear, that he needs to do something about this, that he's right to be angry, and they give him a justification beyond his rage. They tell him that, oh, there's this reason that all the other women are going to rise up. They give him, so he deposes the queen. He says, you're no longer queen. And then he gets lonely, because of course he did. Because he got rid of his queen, because she didn't want to be shown off in front of all of his friends, which seems pretty logical to me. But in Esther chapter 2, it says, later, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. So to solve his loneliness, he decides, because I'm the most powerful man in the world, I'm going to call all of these beautiful women to me, and I'm going to pick a new wife. And this is where Esther comes into our story. So Esther is Jewish. She does not have parents. She's brought up by her uncle or cousin, Mordecai. And Mordecai teaches her and instructs her in the ways of the Jewish people and brings her up. And one day they come and they say, you are beautiful and you're unmarried. We're going to take you off so that the king can decide if he wants to be married to you. And so she goes off and she has 12 months of beauty treatments, during which time it says she did not forget the instructions of Mordecai. He told her, don't tell them that you're Jewish. Go along with what they're doing, but for your own safety, don't tell them that you're Jewish. And she follows his instructions, and eventually, after 12 months, she is made queen. And this movie, I almost said movie, because it feels like a movie. This book feels like a movie. It moves very quickly. So you get, the king is angry, and then he picks a new queen, and then we're like moving on. And so the next section is about Mordecai. And Mordecai has some position in the government, but it says that he's sitting by the city gates one day, and there's these two guards, and they're talking about, they have this conspiracy to kill the king. And so Mordecai hears about it, and he goes to Esther. He says, Esther, they're going to kill the king. And then Esther goes to the king, and they investigate, and she gives credit to Mordecai. And then they find the two guys, and they're taken care of, and the king does not die. And it feels like this should have been something that Xerxes remembered, because if you know anything about history, which I did not before I listened to my brother preach on this, Xerxes dies when he is assassinated by a guard and one of his eunuchs. So should have kept Mordecai around, I guess. I don't know. But Mordecai is not rewarded, which is important. Mordecai is not rewarded. And then we're going to move on because it just keeps moving. After this, the king decides that he likes this guy named Haman, and he makes Haman his second in command. And Haman is an Agagite, which means he is Canaanite, the people who lived in Canaan alongside the Israelites. And Haman is raised up, and it says that he would walk around, and everybody would bow down to him, except for Mordecai. Mordecai does not bow down to Haman, and Haman gets really angry about this. So he goes to the king. He says, King, I want to kill all the Jewish people in your kingdom. Let me do this, and I will give you 10,000 pieces of silver. And the king says, keep your money. Go do your thing. Xerxes really needed some better people around him, because he just makes all these really bad decisions. So he says, keep your money, and Haman, go do your thing, kill all the Jewish people, which is awful. They throw lots, and they decide a day, and they make this decree that all the Jewish people are going to be killed. And so Mordecai hears about it, and he tells Esther, and he says, Esther, you have to go before the king and plead on behalf of your people. Because still people don't know that she's Jewish. And says, go before the king. And she says, I can't. Because if I go before the king without being invited, I will be put to death. Because you can't go before the king unless you're invited by the king. And Mordecai says the most famous phrase from this book. In fact, if you go and look up sermons on Esther, which I did, about half of them are titled For Such a Time as This. Basically, Mordecai tells Esther, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. Maybe, he says, maybe you've been put in this place for such a time as this. And this is what's interesting about the book of Esther, is that the book of Esther is the only book in the Bible that does not mention God. It never says, it never mentions Yahweh. It doesn't say, like that we translate that as the Lord. It doesn't say the Lord. But there's a lot of different places in this where you get called back to the Jewish custom, the Jewish people and their beliefs. And in this place, when it says, maybe you've been put in this position for such a time as this, he's not saying, maybe this is a lucky thing that happened for the Jewish people. He's saying, maybe you've been put here by God because this was coming, because of this moment. And then Esther tells him to go fast and tells all the people to go fast. And she goes before the king. And she tells him, I want you to come to my house for a party. And bring Haman too. And so Haman and the king get invited to this party at Esther's house. I don't know if she was like nervous or what happened. But she goes before the king, which is like this incredible moment of courage in her life. But then she invites him to a party. Oh, man. I forgot to pull up the video. No, we're not going to be able to find it in time. That's okay. It's all right. So have you guys ever watched the VeggieTales version of Esther? The VeggieTales version of Esther is actually pretty accurate. It's like right about what happened, more or less. There's a few different things, but it's more or less what happened. And the scene that I really love in the VeggieTales version of Esther is Haman gets invited to this party, and he goes out and he comes across Mordecai, and Mordecai does not bow down to him. And he gets enraged, and he goes home, and he talks to his wife, and his wife says, build a pole to hang Haman on, and then go to the king and tell him what you want to do. Mordecai. That you want to hang Mordecai on. Yeah, sorry. I keep switching those up. So he's like, Haman's wife says, go build a pole to hang Mordecai on. And so he builds the pole, and then he goes to the party. And then the next day, he goes to talk to the king. And this interesting thing has happened in the night, is the king couldn't sleep. And in the VeggieTales version of it, he's sitting there in bed, and his scribe is sitting next to him, and he's like, at 7 a.m., king cuts himself shaving. And he's like, ooh, ouch, I remember that one. And then he's like, do you got anything more recent? Can you read something more recent? So he skips, and he tells him the story about Mordecai saving his life. And he says, did we ever do anything for him? And Mordecai, and the scribe says, no. That's actually what happened. Is the king couldn't sleep, and so he had the scribe come and read him a story about himself. Read me my story. Tell me about me. It's what we all do, right? We're very selfish. We want to tell people our own story, and we don't like hearing the stories of other people. But at that moment, in the next morning, Haman comes into the room, and he's going to ask the king if he can kill Mordecai. And right at that moment, the king says, hold on, I've got this guy, and I want to honor him because he's done great things for the king. And in another fit of self-absorption, Haman thinks that the king is talking about him. And he says, this is what you should do. Give him your own horse, give him your own clothes, and have someone lead him through the city talking about how great he is. It's just great. It's just perfect. It's just like a movie. It really is. And the king says, yes, I like that idea. Go do that. And you be the one to lead Mordecai through the city. And Haman is utterly, utterly broken. And he goes to tell his wife, and his wife is like, you need to put ashes on your head because you have shamed yourself utterly, or something like that. I forget exactly what she says, but she's like, you're done. You're toast. And so he does not get to hang Mordecai. But that night he goes to another party, because at the first party, Esther invited Haman and the king to come back. They go to another party, and at that party, Esther accuses Haman, and the king is enraged against Haman, and he gets hanged on his own pole, which is why I keep saying Haman, because Haman is the one who gets hanged on his own pole. The king is enraged, and his advisors are like, well, Haman built this pole. We could hang him on it. So they hang Haman. And then the king gives all of Haman's land to Mordecai and his family. And he decrees, he can't counteract his decree, but he decrees that anyone who goes against the Jews, that the Jews have the right to defend themselves against those people. And so when the day comes, they defend themselves, and all of Haman's family is killed, and like his 10 sons are each hanged on their own poles, and it's all very poetic, yeah. It's all very justice. But here's the thing. Esther is a story told in exile. It's a story told when some of the people had begun to go back, but even the ones who had gone back to Jerusalem were still living under another king. They're still under the rule of other people. The entire Jewish population, whether they're in Jerusalem or scattered throughout the empire, they're all waiting for something. They're all waiting for a savior, for a king to rise up. They're all waiting for the person we now know as Jesus. And Esther points us to Jesus in a beautiful way. So the first thing to note is that Esther is bound by faith. She's bound by her people. She's bound by the ways that Mordecai brought her up. She's bound to God and bound by faith. Even though God is not mentioned at all in the Bible, in Esther by name, you when you read it, you sense him the whole way through the story. And Esther is bound by faith to God, and she is rooted in the stories of her people. And here's the thing, is that Esther has no reason to have hope that she's going to be successful. She has no reason to have courage based on her own story. There's nothing in her story that we can look to say, yeah, that's why she thinks God is going to save her. That's why she thinks God has put her in a place for such a time as this. She's an orphan. She's been brought up by her family, but she doesn't have her parents. She is at a very young age, and I mean, she's probably like 14, 15. She's carried off to receive beauty treatments for a year and be isolated from her family. And then she's married off to the most powerful man in the world, who likes to have drunken parties and call his wife to be presented before his friends. There's no reason for Esther to base her hope in God or her hope for her people in her own story. And this is the thing, is that when we encounter the turmoil and the chaos of this world, we look to ourselves. When we want to root ourselves in a place, we look to our own stories. And more often than not, when we look to ourselves, we don't find hope. We find all the places that God was not present, that we feel like God was not present. We find all the places where we feel like we were alone and broken and afraid. Esther is rooted in hope. She takes courage because of the story of her people, because of the ways that God had engaged with the Jewish people for years and years and years and years. The stories, the ways that she's been brought up by Mordecai, that's what she's rooted in. And it still takes incredible courage for her to go before the king. But when we root ourselves, when we're bound by faith, and when we root ourselves in stories of hope, we don't root ourselves in our own stories. We listen to the stories of those around us. We listen to the ways that God has engaged in other people's stories. We listen to the stories of Jesus. So, listen. And the last way that Esther points us to Jesus is that she moves in a direction of love. She is moved in a direction by love. So who knows John 3:16? Anybody? For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Beautiful verse. Who knows 1 John 3:16? I love this. My youth pastor did this to us one time. 1 John 3:16 says, "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers." In a story of selfishness, of self-seeking behavior, of self-ambition, of the most powerful man in the world demanding things, and his second in command trying to commit mass genocide because he's angry at one guy, like in a story filled with selfishness, Esther sets aside her own life for her people. And this is what we do. We go to each other and we hold up all of our stuff, all of our desires, all of our demands, and we go to our wives or our kids or our friends or our parents or our coworkers and we say, how are you going to take care of this? How are you going to take care of me? We hold it all and we say, here it is. I want you to take care of me. And what Esther shows us, and the way she points us to Jesus, is in this. That this is how we know what love is. That Jesus Christ laid aside his life for us. And this is what Esther does, is she sets aside her life. The way we are called to engage with each other is to set aside our own selfishness, to set aside the ways that we want others to come through for us, and to seek ways to come through for them. We can't fulfill them. And that's the thing, is that we can't take care of everything in the lives of the people around us. But we can engage in love and set aside our own selves to care for those around us. I have a couple minutes for one or two thoughts or questions or... Okay, we're going to move on.